please welcome Sonja Diaz.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining the Pacific Council today to explore what will happen after November 3rd, a prediction on some of the likely outcomes from the ballot counting and certification process, the impact of foreign interference, and the almost certainly inevitable contention that will result from this election, regardless of which candidate is chosen. My name is Sonja Diaz, and I'm a Programs Associate at the Pacific Council. And as you may know, the Pacific Council has had a local to global voter campaign initiative going on throughout this election season to encourage our members to vote and inform them on the local to global implications of the issues that are on the ballot this season, and just to show our general support for the act of voting as a part of participating in our democracy. And so this upcoming election has very much been on our mind, as I'm sure it is on all of yours as well. And today we have a big topic that we're getting into, but we're joined by two excellent experts to get into this. So before I introduce them, I'll just share a couple notes for you all in our audience. If you'd like to ask a question, you can click on the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen at any time and submit your questions. We'll be saving time for that at the end. So again, feel free to submit questions to the Q&A box. You're also encouraged, if you would like, to ask your questions to our speakers directly. If you would prefer to speak your questions to our experts, you can simply click the raise hand function at the bottom of your screen, and that will be how we know that you would like to ask your questions. So we will make sure to unmute you at that time so that way you can ask your question directly to our speakers. But without further ado, let me introduce our experts today. We are joined by Dan Schnur, who is a professor at USC's Annenberg School of Communications and at UC-Berkeley's Institute of Governmental Studies. He is also the founder of the USC LA Times statewide political poll. And Sonja Diaz, who is a civil rights attorney and policy advisor, and is also founding director of UCLA's Latino Policy and Politics Initiative. And she has a wealth of experience on voting rights and an experience in policy council at the state level. So Dan, Sonja, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having us. Maya.
So let's jump right in. First, I'll pose this first question to both of you, but what makes this election different than other elections that we've had in the past? I think an obvious answer is that it's due to COVID-19, but at least the impression that I've gotten in the media, it seems like there are other factors at play as well that are influencing the direction of this election being historic and unprecedented in ways that we haven't yet experienced. So I'll pose that question to both of you, but Dan, if you'd like to start.
Okay. Well, Sonja, thank you so much for having me, and thanks to you, to Alex, to Jerry, and to the whole team at the Pacific Council. It's great to be here with you, and I've been a fan of Sonja and her work at UCLA for quite some time now. So I'm really excited to have a chance to be part of this conversation with her and with all of your members. Well, not all of your members, but many of your members. We were joking about this right before the program started about whether we should set aside 1 hour for a conversation on the post-November 3rd possibilities, or 12 hours for that conversation. And we could do the same thing, I think, to discuss what's unique about this election. But the one thing I would point out, and it's not something that leapt out of the blue at us, it's an extension of a longtime trend in American politics, is just how incredibly polarized and divided and how balkanized the electorate has become. And a lot of what we'll be talking about over the next 50 some minutes is based on what happens if there is not a certain outcome on November 3rd. I think one of the reasons those questions and those challenges are going to be so difficult is because the level of distrust between partisans on both sides right now is so high that they are so much more willing to assume the absolute worst on the other side. I'll defer to Sonja in just a second, but I'll make one other point on this, because not only not only are we an increasingly polarized nation, an increasingly polarized electorate, but there's a considerable amount of academic research that demonstrates that this polarization is now driven by negative partisanship. And for many, many years, for most of the history of modern democracy, most people joined a political party, one or the other, or in other countries, one of many, because of their belief in that party's principles and goals. And what we're seeing increasingly now in American politics and in politics in many of the other Western democracies is people join their party not because of their belief in their party's agenda and their party's goals, but because of a distaste and often a hatred for those in the other party. And if you really do believe that the people on the other side of the aisle are stupid or evil or worse, then giving up when the polls close on election night seems like a capitulation that's much more difficult to make if rather than if you simply assumed that while the other party might not prioritize your goals, they're good and decent people who want to make our country a better place to live and just have a different set of goals on how to achieve them. Because that divisiveness and that suspicion and negative partisanship, to me, that is unique. And again, it didn't leap out of the blue in 2016, but what we're seeing is an extension and intensification of trends that have been building in American politics for many, many years.
And Sonja, before you jump in, I just want to, again, make a note to our audience. We actually just launched a quick poll, if you could participate in that, just wanting your thoughts on whether you think we'll have a clear winner on November 3rd. So thank you for participating in that. But Sonja, go ahead.
Yeah, really happy to be here. Happy to be here with you, Dan. One of the things to layer on top of that is demographics. And what we find is that demographic trends in this country have made it so that we now have a generation, Gen Z, which is least white of any previous American generation. We also have another American generation, which is very numerous, and that's baby boomers, who were exposed to the most white, least amount of immigrants of any Americans in contemporary society. So you have these different age groups, but you also have ethnic contours that have presented us at a moment in post-Obama legacy where we have, as one writer in The Atlantic put, the largest racist coalition in American history. And so to the point about this negative partisanship or negative political identification, one of the things that's really important is a lot of people that are coming into the electorate are declined to state or are not, affiliated with either of the two major political parties. We still have some states, including a marquee battleground state, the state of Arizona, which has a third of the electorate that is independent. And so this is to say is that partisanship matters, polarization matters, but there's an opportunity. And I think that we've seen it in this science fiction year of 2020 between the pandemic, worsening economic inequality, and the racial reckoning in our streets to ensure that Black people are not killed at the hands of police. Now, all of this has persuaded some changes that we're already seeing in this week. And I'm so excited to talk about because there are some trends that are historical that we lament going into this election that we're seeing flip right now. And that's particularly around youth turnout. So we're in a very difficult part of understanding both the failure of our systems and our institutions in this country, but recognizing the power of the vote to get over the hump, to become a sophisticated society where we can be back with our peer countries in dealing with COVID-19. That is a direction from how we've dealt with it to date.
Thank you so much for that. And we're certainly going to pick up on this idea of the composition of people that are turning out to vote and polarization later on in this discussion. But to switch gears a little bit, Dan, we just presented this poll to our audience. Based on what our audience is saying, about 63% believe that we will have a clear winner on November 3rd for this election, 37% saying no. Dan, what do you think? What are the factors that are going to determine whether we learn the results of the presidential election on November 3rd?
Okay, well, first, I have to register a protest on behalf of Sonja and myself, because Sonja, I don't know about you, but I was excited to see the poll question come up during the opening of the presentation, and then I saw a little note saying panelists can't vote. I think that is unjust and unfair, and I think we should boycott the rest of the program.
Well, I'm happy to hear you guys jump in on that now, so feel free.
No, I think this is actually a much easier question to answer than the first one, which we could have spent all afternoon on, if not more. We'll know, the one thing that will determine whether we know on election night or not is the margin of victory for one candidate or the other. In a closely contested race, given the number of states that are struggling to deal with an unprecedented number of mail ballots and other early voting, if it's a close race, then we might not know for several days, if not weeks. If, on the other hand, a few of the key early swing states break in one direction or another decisively, we could end up knowing on election night. The professional prognosticating class, which did not learn our lesson in November of 2016, estimates that the likelihood of a Biden landslide is roughly the same, perhaps a little bit more, of a Trump narrow victory. And what I would say somewhat more cautiously than that is, when we watch the returns come in on election night, the way we'll be able to answer your question, Samaya, on whether the results will be available that night or not, is watch the states of Florida and of North Carolina, because both are states that Trump carried in 2016, and both, for very different reasons, have mechanisms in place to count most, if not all, of their ballots on election day and election night. So unless it is just a hair's breadth difference, those states should be called even before the East Coast goes to bed, let alone us in California. And if Biden wins either one of those two states, then it becomes much more difficult for Trump to win the presidency. Other Eastern states that'll be closely contested, the states we've learned to watch, like Pennsylvania and Michigan, for any number of reasons, if those states are close, we will probably not know for several days what the results are. But early on, watch Florida and North Carolina, and that'll tell you whether you can get a good night's sleep on Tuesday night, or whether we'll be on pins and needles for days or weeks after the election.
So let's say we're in a worst case scenario where we have tons of issues with mail-in ballots taking a long time to arrive and be counted, and you have days or maybe even weeks that have passed by since November 3rd, and we still don't have a clear winner. What does the world look like, or at least the United States look like, under those circumstances?
It looks like California, who has such a large swath of our electorate that votes by mail. We saw this in the 2018 midterms. Orange County, the red curtain, the night of the election still seemed to be in Republican control. Not everything was counted. Stuff was not counted for a few days afterwards. And the Democratic Party swept all of those House seats. And, you know, the point here is that there's a lack of information, and there is growing disdain in trust of government. And that is part of the principles that are leading our nation today. And when I say principles, I mean people, not ideas. But also, it's just a lack of, you know, trusted messengers generally in society during a time where we're going into a presidential election where not that much has changed in the mechanics that we saw in 2016. We still have misinformation that has remained largely unaddressed and unregulated. We still have the proliferation of voter suppression, which has continued to evolve to now create discord with the United States Postal Service and to continue to have this uptick of voter fraud is both nonsensical and empirically erroneous, but somehow it is associated with vote by mail, which the biggest example that I think is just so fascinating as a voting rights attorney is that the state of North Carolina had a very arduous voter ID law. Now, it had a disparate impact, and many can say that that was intentional, on minority voters and poor voters. In that voter ID law, they did not require voter ID for absentee voters, who in the state of North Carolina up until the cycle tended to be whiter, more mature, and more affluent. And so the fact that we are here again and that same side is saying that there is somehow some issue with voter fraud when it did not become a place to legislate, when all of the legislation was occurring after Shelby County, shows the partisan nature of this. Now, so we have misinformation, we have voter suppression, then we have COVID. And what COVID has done to our state and local elections officials is it has made a very complicated job even more difficult. without any congressional support and financing, because there was not another reauthorization of COVID relief and recovery that could have provided much needed resources to have a safe and fair election. So you have people who are not used to presiding over an election of this magnitude during a global pandemic, nor should they have been, but they're under-resourced. All of this means is that it is just a very complicated problem, but we've seen some really exciting things that bring me some joy. Like, you know, driving today was exciting to see that people actually, through trusted messaging, said, vote early and make a plan, and they're doing it. Today, the state of Texas has more votes cast in early vote than in the entire 2016 cycle.
If I can add just one point to that, Samaya, because I think Sonja provided a tremendous overview. I just want to follow up on one point she made about misinformation. In the state of Minnesota today, the current governor, Tim Walz, released a public service announcement with him and his three predecessors as governor, one Democrat, one Republican, and one independent, for those who are old enough to remember Governor Jesse Ventura. And the four of them collectively in the same advertisement told the people of Minnesota, reminded the people of Minnesota, that if we do not have results on election night, that's not a cause for panic. It's not a cause for unrest. It's not a bad thing. It's a good thing, because it means the counting is proceeding the way that it's supposed to. And the one thing I'd ask of a well-informed, well-educated group like Pacific Council members is, if you're tuning into a discussion like this on a weekday morning, you, of course, already know that days or even weeks of ballot counting, while stressful, is a good thing, not a bad thing. But public opinion polling shows that a large plurality of our country does not understand that. Back in early August, a poll was taken that showed that roughly 70% of Americans believed that results would be available on election night. Only 30% understood that would not be the case. As of a couple weeks ago, those numbers had almost flipped through good effort by the news media and by other responsible leaders. But that still means that roughly 1/4 of the American people think that if we don't get election results on election night, that something bad has happened. And they're going to be worried and they're going to be panicked, and we could potentially see unrest as a result of this. The one thing I'd ask, as obvious it is to all of us participating in this discussion today, is over the next few days, tell your friends, tell your neighbors, tell your family members, tell your work colleagues that while it would be nice to have this election behind us by the time we go to bed on election night, if that's not the case, that's okay too. The more people who understand that, the more likely we are to get through it. Could be a very trying period till a final resolution.
Well, I certainly appreciate hearing that from you, because that helps me sleep a little bit better tonight as well. But I'm curious, Sonja, to your point about voter suppression, what role could local or state governments play in the outcome of this election, particularly when there have been issues of voter suppression in different states and questions going to the courts about how long states can accept mail-in ballots? Do you anticipate a lot of variance in how ballots will be counted and how long they'll even be allowed to be counted?
We already see that there's variance. The election administration is a state function, which trickles down to local governments. They're doing it in satisfaction for down ballot races, but also our premier federal races, whether it's control of Congress or the White House. Now, one of the things that we know is that without Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, which asks certain jurisdictions, some entire states and some counties like in California, any electoral change, whether it was a change of a polling location to ensuring that early vote hours were either elongated or shortened, had to be cleared by a federal judge or the U.S. Department of Justice. That went out the door in 2013. We know in honoring the late Justice, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, her analogy of going out into a rainstorm without an umbrella was something that she wrote in her dissenting opinion in that Shelby County case. So state and local elections officials have an outsized role to play in the election. And historically, we've seen leadership that tries to suppress the vote. We've heard of literacy test, poll tests, but today, contemporary voter suppression includes arduous voter registration. still having to go in person to register to vote during a global pandemic, supposed to be physically distancing, not expanding vote by mail. The Voting Rights Project, part of my think tank UCLA, filed a suit in Texas. In Texas, you have to be over the age of 65 and have a valid excuse to vote by mail. Now, this is nonsensical when there is a tried and true method with absentee voting that is fraudulent. In fact, it's a paper trail, and it is empirically shown to be safe. Paper is safer than having to be in close proximity with other people. And so there are so many limitations, and we see some state elected officials, whether it is a governor, a secretary of state, or attorney general, filing suits in defense or affirmatively to expand access to the ballot box. Now, local governments have an important role. Again, they're doing this with their hands tied. They didn't get extra resources. And this is a really complicated job outside of the coronavirus pandemic. But who is hurting are people that are first-time voters, low propensity voters, or first-time vote by mailers. And that's because this is an exercise of first impression. And there is not resources to ensure that there's linguistic and cultural messaging to reach these voters. But how do you vote by mail? How do you do it right? How do you ensure that your signature matches? I was on a call with a reporter yesterday in Florida, and he voted for the first time in the UK. And he's now able to vote. He's now a citizen, and he does not have a signature on his passport. So he went and he voted, and now he has to go do a signature matching. All that, you know, those are extra steps for people who may not have shelter right now, have lost their job, and are trying not to get sick.
I'm curious too. I also had a similar issue when I was sending in my ballot just a couple of days ago, worrying about whether or not my signature would match, because I couldn't remember what signature I originally had on my voter registration. But I'm curious on your point about the people that, you know, are having their first impressions of voting impacted by this. Do you see that having a long-term impact in terms of people that will vote again or decide to vote in the future just based on their experience with this particular election?
Yeah, and I think Dan can go on this. I think one of the things, and this gets to a question in the chat about the Latino vote. There's structural reasons why we have a turnout gap. Part of it is Latinos are young. They're youthful demographics. 6 out of 10 Latinos are millennial or younger, meaning they're aging into the electorate. And so the way that campaigns operate is you want to get to 50+1. You want to get to victory. And you're going to get there based on the analytics of likely voters, not first-time voters and not propensity voters. So the least likely people to vote will continue to be the least likely people to vote. There's an intervention that is able to make them a likely voter so they can benefit from all the information, all the engagement, and all the mobilization, whether in person or. Now, in the case of this election, we are really excited about the early vote numbers. This is true in places across the country, including North Carolina, but there's still a turnout gap amongst Latino voters. And part of this is young people. It's not like they have voted by mail before. We know that prior to this cycle, the people who voted by mail were more affluent, more mature, and tended to be whiter. And we do know through public opinion polling that now there's a partisan slant to who believes in the efficacy of vote by mail. It's Democrats this cycle more than Republicans. And then in terms of the ballots that are actually being cast, they lean Democrat. All of this means is that people left out will be left out again. And they just get baked into that cycle where there's an unfair advantage and asymmetrical access to information. But Dan, I'm sure you want to share more.
No, there's, I'll just add a couple of quick thoughts because I think, Sonja, you're exactly right in your overview of the question Samaya raised. What I would say is a former political practitioner a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, is campaigns, and Sonja's exactly right about this, campaigns are about low-hanging fruit. There's a finite amount of money, and more importantly, there's an even more finite amount of time before an election. And therefore, campaigns in both parties tend to use a great majority of their time, of their resources, of their money to turn out the most likely voters. Now, when either party makes an effort to provide extra time and extra effort, and extra encouragement and extra guidance to low propensity voters, they almost inevitably benefit just tremendously from it. Go back a generation and the Republicans' effort with religious conservative voters, with evangelical and fundamentalist voters who until Roe versus Wade thought that politics was beneath them. They weren't habitual voters, but the Republicans put in great time and effort, and we've seen the results. More recently, the Democratic Party has done precisely the same thing in many places, though not all, Texas, in providing those kind of additional resources and guidance for young people and for Latinx and Asian Pacific voters. When a party does make that investment, like I said, it yields the benefits tremendously. But in the rush of the last days before the election, it's a lot easier to go back to someone who's voted in 3 of the last 4 elections than it is to put in the extra time and effort to convince someone to do this for the first time. So the one other point I'll make, I think your question is a critically important one, is what does this first time experience mean for young people as they get older? We know there's been a lot of research done on this, that if a young person casts the ballot for a presidential candidate in one party or the other in their first 3 elections, they are far more likely to remain a member of that party throughout their adulthood. So for the late baby boomers and early Gen Xers who first began voting in the 1980s, they are still the most Republican generational cohort in the entire electorate, even though for many of them, their circumstances have changed. You know, when you do, just like everybody knows that the best music ever written was written when you were in high school. By the same token, if you vote for a party in your first few elections, you stick with it. And I think one of the greatest challenges for the Republican Party going forward is the extraordinary number of millennials and Gen Zers who will have voted for Obama. Well, the Gen Z won't have voted for Obama, but the millennials having voted for Obama and Clinton and no Biden are going to be lifelong Democrats. And that's going to be a hill very difficult for Republicans to climb going forward. We also have research, and then I will shut up, that shows that if somebody has a difficult experience, per your question, the first time they vote, it's going to be harder to convince them to go back. And that's not unique to politics. If you have a bad experience at anything for the first time, if you go to a restaurant for the first time, don't have a good meal, I'm not going to be able to get you to go back there. If you didn't like the first Avengers movie, I don't think I'm going to get you to the sequels. And so if voting this first time out is a frustrating experience, it'll be that much harder to get that young person or that person of color to go back in 2 years or 4 years, but it's almost always worth the effort.
So I feel like we've been dancing a little bit around the question of who's actually turning out to vote. So Sonja, I'll ask, what should we expect really in terms of voter turnout and the composition of voters this year, and how, if at all, is that going to look different than the people that turned out to vote in 2016?
So 2 things. One, early vote is going to look completely different than in 2016. And that is because of the decisions and the directions coming out of this White House that pertains to vote by mail. And so what we're seeing is people who traditionally have not voted by mail starting to do it. And that means more diverse, younger, and less affluent voters. And who are going to stick with it in the cycles to come? It's a good question to know. Who knows when COVID-19 is going to leave the United States of America? Now, in terms of voter turnout, I'm really excited. I'm excited about young people voting. This is an electoral group that historically has a huge turnout gap with more mature Americans. This is true of when the voting age went down to 18 and people were going off to Vietnam to die. Still didn't vote at the same levels. But what we're seeing right now, and this is what's so important and cool about voting, voting is just one part of civic engagement. Civic engagement is also participating in a community meeting, at a city council, being in the streets protesting, saying that you don't want guns in your school. And so people, and Gen Z in particular, have been really engaged in an outsized way during the Trump administration. We see this around climate change, around school violence, around the movement for Black lives. Now, what we're seeing right now is some changing numbers around young people who are voting early. Again, election day is 4 days away, and we already have all of these votes that have been cast. And this is remarkable because it bakes these voters in for cycles to come. To Dan's point, you put this investment or you take this action, you will reap so many benefits of getting the information, the encouragement, and the targeting to do it over and over and over again. And what I'm excited about is that means we're going to have a more inclusive democracy, because the voices that traditionally don't participate in casting a ballot are showing themselves to do that now. Now, will there still be disparities? Absolutely. And we have scientific literature as to why. We also will be doing research post to figure out how to close this gap. Ultimately, what is great is that by having young people who, again, Gen Z being more diverse than any previous gen, means that you're going to have an uptick in engagement. Now, there's one other piece that I want to add where, and we haven't researched this yet because the data is not there. But what I'm encouraged about is that Asian Americans and Latinos are the fastest growing and the most youthful demographics in the country. That's been true of California. It's now true of the rest of the country. Now, if we do find that it's these voters that are young, they're casting a ballot because of their household formations, right? They're not living alone in a condominium. They are likely with other family members, sometimes in multi-generational families, they're trusted messengers. So for Latino voters, we get our message from teachers, from doctors, from firefighters, and from family members. And so if you have a young family member who is voting, chances are they may be encouraged in a mixed status family or multi-generational immigrant family, generational status differences. They could be those messengers about who to vote for down ballots. You're not just getting one voter, you're getting a lot. And that's really exciting to me, because that means that they're going to be able to engage and hopefully have a net positive experience this cycle, despite all the barriers.
Sonja, Samaya, I know that you have questions still to ask, and they're beginning to stack up in the chat room also. But if I can weigh in on this, because I think Sonja raises just several really, really smart points that I'll just like to add on to a little bit. On the last one, the idea is young people as the messengers. One of the things we've seen here in Los Angeles, primarily in several of the area charter schools, is voter education and mobilization projects in high schools and middle schools. Of course, middle schoolers can't vote, and most high schoolers can't vote either. But those programs are run because the schools are those young kids' parents and grandparents' lifeline into the community. And by holding those kind of programs at the schools, it introduces voting to a first-generation American to understand that they do have a role in the process. I keep citing academic research, and that's just a bad habit that we have as academics. But I'll cite another study as well. The single most reliable indicator on whether a young person will vote or not is if they are raised in a household in which at least one adult is a regular voter. And if there are no adults in that household who vote, or who are not permitted to vote for any number of reasons, that 18 and 20-year-old is much less likely to vote also, and even more in need of external resources and encouragement and guidance in order to do so. And then finally, Samaya, back to your question about turnout. I think predicting turnout is almost as dangerous as predicting election results in advance. And I'll offer two pieces of evidence on that. Because generally when we project voter turnout, we tend to, and this goes back to a point that Sonja was making a little bit earlier, we tend to make those predictions based on previous turnout, as well as on self-expressed interest in the campaign. And so what that means is we're guessing. And in 2016, the most respected polling experts in the country underestimated the number of white working class voters who would turn out on election day, because those voters simply hadn't turned out for Mitt Romney or John McCain or George Bush the way they were going to for Donald Trump. 4 years earlier, the polls were even further off. And that's because the pollsters underestimated the number of young people and voters from communities of color who were going to turn out. Now, we noticed 2016 more because the difference between a narrow Barack Obama victory and a large Obama victory, which is what happened, is much less memorable than the difference between a narrow Hillary Clinton victory and a narrow Donald Trump one. But in either case, what polls missed, because there's no way for them to catch, is people defying historical vote patterns. And so I would throw in a cautionary note about projecting turnout, because we do tend to rely heavily on how people have behaved in the past, and there's no guarantee they'll behave the same way in the current election cycle.
Well, I certainly appreciate you giving us that additional context. I know in the title of this event, we threw in the word a prediction, so I feel a need to shoehorn you in a little bit on some predictions, but certainly understand that this is not an exact science. So, it's certainly good to hear that context as well. As you mentioned, we are getting a lot of questions coming in, but before we switch to the audience questions, again, a reminder, you can submit your questions to the Q&A box, or you can raise your hand and we can unmute you if you'd like to ask your question directly. But another issue that we haven't addressed yet, having talked about voter suppression and the issue of COVID, of course, is foreign interference. And obviously, it's undeniable that foreign interference in our elections is happening, as it has in the past, and as it surely will continue to happen, given that it happens across the world. What exactly should we be expecting in terms of how that might influence the outcome of this, Dan, and how are we seeing that unfold? And should we be concerned?
Well, we should be concerned, if only because of what we saw in 2016. But I will say this, even given the president's demonstrated lack of interest and attention in this issue, and I'm not taking sides, it's been reported that the president has told his advisors this is not something he particularly focuses on, that even while President Trump has not paid a great deal of attention to this challenge, it is very clear the Department of Homeland Security and the Department of Justice, nonpartisan, lifelong career civil servants, have been putting in a tremendous amount of time and effort in order to protect our voting apparatus from foreign interference. And so I think the threat of a foreign entity interfering with the actual vote casting or tabulation is relatively slim, because the precautions that local and state governments take to protect that information is considerable as well. Two things that are worth watching out for is, while the likelihood of foreign interference in the election is relatively low, those international bad actors are just as interested and just as excited by the threat of impact as opposed to actual impact. And so even if it's not going to happen, what they're hoping to do is to cause panic, to cause unrest among the American people, that the election results can't be relied on. So they're not likely to interfere with the results themselves. What they are trying really hard to do is get us to turn on each other so that we don't trust those results when they come in. And my greatest hope is, if we do face that kind of post-election scenario where the election results genuinely are unknown for a period of time, I would hope that former presidents of both parties would be willing to stand up and remind us that the system is secure, and those who are trying to cause panic among the electorate and among the American people shouldn't be allowed to succeed. So the voting itself appears to be fairly safe, but the panic that the threat of interference can cause is a much more considerable threat. And ironically, it's one that we as citizens have much more control over.
Yeah, I have a lot of follow-up on that, but I'll actually go ahead and start taking some of these audience questions, because I know people are anxious to have their questions answered as well. We have a question from Jerry Green, our president and CEO here at the Pacific Council, which is an important question that I was looking to ask myself to Sonja. We're hearing a lot about the importance of the Latino vote in this upcoming election. And it looks like we actually might have lost Sonja. So actually, I'll give her a minute to jump back on the call, and we can go to this next question. Sorry about that, Jerry. We'll jump to your question a little bit later. So instead, a question to you, Dan, from Vahid Korsan. The reduction of on-campus learning at colleges doesn't seem to have negatively impacted young voter turnout, as was initially thought. Has that been shown to be true, that younger voters not being on their campus or having on college learning has impacted their ability or willingness to vote in this election?
So we see two things going on here. One, we know from past experience that the most efficient and effective way to get college students to vote is to reach out to them on their college campuses, not necessarily in their classes, but in the quad, on Truesdale at USC, on Sproul Plaza at Berkeley, and to engage with those young people when they're engaging in the college experience. Because they are attending college virtually and doing distance learning this semester, that doesn't exist. The question is exactly correct. In spite of that, youth voter turnout does look to be, as Sonja was talking about earlier, at very high levels. But that's happening in spite of the lack of logistical outreach opportunities that normally exist on a campus. So the fact that youth turnout is not lower than it was 4 years ago is encouraging, but that's a testament to these young people, because I can say with some confidence that no matter how high turnout goes among millennials and Gen Z, it's going to be lower than it would be if those young people were attending their classes in person rather than by Zoom.
Right. Well, and I'll ask this second question from Vahid, and then we'll jump back to Jerry's question. Looking beyond this election, do you think there's going to be a permanent change in terms of how prevalent early voting and voting by mail will be, or is this going to be a one-time thing or potentially multiple-time thing, more tied to COVID and the circumstances we see the country in now?
No, I think many, not just in politics, but in society, many of the changes we're experiencing from COVID are going to be with us for a long time after we're able to return to pre-2020 life. And we've seen that, we'll see that in terms of travel. We'll see that in terms of socializing. I read a wonderful story about the 1918 pandemic, if there's such a thing as a wonderful story about a pandemic. It said that before 1918, when the Spanish flu came to this country, that when you had people over for a meal in your home, what was considered to be the polite thing to do was for everyone to drink out of the same cup. You would pass the cup from person to person throughout the meal and drink the water, drink the wine, whatever it happened to be. That was obviously a tradition that was discontinued because of the Spanish flu, but it never came back. And I think any other number of changes in society are going to far outlive COVID-19. One of them, happily, is that we will always, from this point forward, rely much more heavily on mail voting and on early voting than we had pre-2020. It might subside a little bit because a lot of people just do like going to the polls on election day. There's sort of a civic charge that comes from it, but we're not going back. And I think if anything, in the years ahead, we'll see more and more states move toward heavier reliance on early voting by mail and in person as a result of what they've learned this year.
Yeah, I'm glad to hear that trend from the pandemic in 1918 did not come back about sharing cups, and hopefully we'll have some other positive changes like that, like early voting and mail-in voting becoming more prevalent. Sonja, to get back to Jerry's question, this discussion that we're hearing a lot about the Latino vote, is there really any analytic utility in looking at the Latino vote, given that it is such a diverse group filled with people of all different races, speaking various languages, different age demographics from over, dozens of countries? What is the value in looking at the Latino group, and how reliable is that as a measure?
There's absolute value in looking at demographic contours of electoral engagement. This is true not only of Latinos, but of Asian American, Pacific Islanders, of Black voters, who include those who are the descendants of slaves here in the United States of America, those from the Caribbean, those from the continental diaspora of Africa itself. So as it relates to Latino vote, I mean, I just wish we had a not seriously flawed census this year, because that data is so important. But with the data that we do have from previous cycles, we know that there's geographic contours of Latino communities. So the Southwest looks different than the Northeast, and that's true of the US South. But there are very few states that don't have important and emerging Latino communities and Latino electorates. So from our research at the Latino Policy and Politics Initiative at UCLA, we found in 2018 the outsized role of Latino voters in the midterms Our research empirically found that of the 40 seats that flipped from Republican control to Democratic control in the United States Congress, half of those seats were victorious because of the power of the Latino vote. This was true not only in California, but elsewhere. Now, going into this cycle, one of the things that's really important is that there's just been a lack of investment in engaging and mobilizing voters of color. That's not just an issue with Latino voters or API voters, but also traditionally Black voters. This cycle, there are key battlegrounds where Latinos could be very helpful in slim, narrow margins. Pennsylvania comes to mind. So the state of Pennsylvania has the second largest number of Puerto Ricans who left the island after Hurricane Maria. Pennsylvania was very close in 2016. We also know that Latinos lean Democrat. Latinos have been polled time and time again this cycle in favor of VP Biden at, huge margins. Where there are narratives that are not accurate and not useful is twofold. One, that somehow that Latinos are like exceptional to traditional American voters by nature of their culture. So the same split that we're seeing in terms of gender partisanship, which is the widest gap in the history of contemporary American politics, that's an American issue between how American women and American men are voting and who they prefer in terms of their candidate choice. It's not a Latino issue. You see it with Black Americans too. This is a male-female split. Now, in terms of conservative Latinos, they exist because part of the function of American democracy is you get to choose who you want to vote for, and your skin color doesn't determine that. That said, there are conservative trends in Latino electorates. This is true of places like Texas, Arizona, and Florida. But what we saw in 2018 is the state of Arizona, for the first time in 3 decades, sent a Democrat to the United States Senate. They have another contested race right now. We also see Nevada, another battleground state that has strong labor organizing benchmark, showing the Latino vote just turn out, but they have someone top of the ticket. They have the first Latina U.S. senator in the history of the United States Congress who is mobilizing that vote. Now, there's a lot to be said about ultimately what the vote split is, but I always come back to the point that in the 2016 cycles, 54% of white women who voted for Donald Trump. So if we're looking at 22% of Latinos that are going to vote for Donald Trump, that's pure just choice and electoral partisanship that existed previous to these candidates and previous to this election in particular.
We have another question from someone in the audience about the issue of what would happen if Democrats take over the House and Senate in this upcoming election. And it's actually a little more in the frame of judicial issues, but do either of you anticipate Democrats bringing articles of impeachment for Judges Coney Barrett and Kavanaugh in that situation?
Dan, you want to take this one?
Yeah, I don't. I'm not a lawyer, and so if Sonja disagrees with me, that means that she's right and I'm wrong. But through a purely political lens, I think it's unlikely. First of all, it's worth noting that regardless of what you think of the process by which Justice Barrett was nominated and confirmed, the American people are actually relatively split on this. And so I think for President Biden, looking to his credit, if he's elected, looking to unite the country, I think overseeing impeachment proceedings against a sitting Supreme Court justice would undermine those unification efforts in a very dramatic way. The pressure he's already facing is whether or not to expand the court. And I say this not as a partisan, as I think many of you know, I switched from Republican to no party preference many years ago. But I worry about the court expansion because if the Democrats were to add a certain number of justices next year, the next time Republicans held Congress and the White House, they would add more. And before too long, we would be holding Supreme Court hearings in the Rose Bowl because no other entity would be large enough to hold the entire court, What I do think will get more serious consideration, something that Biden first dismissed but now seems to have cautiously walked back from, is the idea of term limits for Supreme Court justices. The idea that a justice would be appointed and would serve for an 18-year term, and then if she or he chose, could then serve on the federal bench elsewhere off the court or retire if that's their preference, which means in the first year of every president's term, the president, she or he, would name a Supreme Court justice in their first year, another in their third year, and that would simply become part of the election and campaigning process, talking about those two appointments, because you know that every president would have at least two in one term, 4 and 2. Like I said, the Vice President Biden has sounded somewhat hesitant about that, but to me, it sounds like a less apocalyptic option than the idea of making the court larger, knowing that that's a slippery slope that could lead to a court that would have a very difficult time operating. But I'll defer to the barrister.
Sonja, do you want to weigh in?
Yeah, I mean, look, and Dan brought a good point. What is something that is feasible and what is something that is politically feasible? So what I'll say is we are in the midst of a global pandemic. We have now seen a third uptick in infections, and we're likely to continue to see the unnecessary loss of life. For anybody that is going to be victorious from the White House down to a county supervisor, the most important thing is keeping Americans safe. And so to engage in a political battle of the magnitude that gets to the failure of our systems to function, I don't think that's top of mind in terms of saving American lives. We're at war with COVID-19 right now, and our focus should really be on overcoming that so that we could recover and we can continue to have the American economic dominance that fuels not only the continental United States, but the world. Now, to the point of what is feasible, you know, this is a political question. Not all American voters who are voting are enthusiastic about either party or either candidate top of ticket. Ultimately, to the extent that we continue this courageous movement towards civic engagement, demanding more from our leaders, asking for changes from our law enforcement to our public health administrators to our governors, this means that there's a place for the American populace to essentially persuade and advocate on behalf of the systematic changes we need to see. I do think that our structures and our systems have failed. That's been clear in the way that we've not only dealt with COVID, but the worsening inequality, whereby we have so many people who do not have shelter. Now, if we're going to recover, there are policy changes that need to happen. We need a highly skilled, highly educated workforce for the 21st century. COVID has only continued to propel automation and a digitalization of the way that we work. And some people are left behind. Those people that are left behind are the people that are going to be in the workforce for generations to come. Now, to this point of the court, you know, there's different ways to modify these structures and these systems. One is through the United States Congress. Another way is through the states. And ultimately, I believe firmly that the reason that we got to this place was a focus on state change, state legislative control, gerrymandering on the part of the Republican Party over the course of the last few decades. They've been hugely successful. Now, if we want to see changes to our Constitution, which again have not happened in years and years, last time they happened was really after the Civil Rights Act and during the Vietnam War. I believe that it's time for some sort of structures change, whether that's an expansion of the courts, whether that is the Equal Rights Amendment, whether that is the dissolution of the Electoral College. That's to be determined by either United States Congress or our states. Now, that is not an overnight, first 100 days, first term exercise. I think right now the focus is really going to have to be overcoming the huge structural issues that we have in our response to a global pandemic and overcoming the reopening of an economy that simply is at a standstill.
We're running up on time, so I want to make sure we get in a couple more questions. But you know, to that point of how some of these things are going to be very, very long, if not decade or generational long changes. We have a question from Bob Lutz relating to vote by mail. Do you think that this will ensure that elections, particularly national elections, have longer and longer campaign cycles? And do you think there's a legitimate time frame for a presidential campaign basically to take place? And I'll echo Bob's comment here because I'm certainly feeling it myself. What about this issue of campaign fatigue, which I'm certainly feeling, and I'm sure many of our audience has been feeling that right now? Do you think that that's going to be a permanent or a longer term shift that we see as a result of voting by mail?
I'll make 2 quick points and then defer to Sonja. One, it is impossible for a presidential campaign to get any longer. Literally, it will begin next Wednesday morning, and someone argued that it already has. When Senator Ben Sasse criticized Donald Trump very harshly a couple of weeks ago, that was not the beginning, but the extension of the Republican primary campaign for 2024, and the Democrats are already underway as well. So we're not going to make it, we couldn't make it any longer. Vote by mail has good sides and bad sides, but that's just a statistical and existential impossibility. As far as campaign fatigue, as I mentioned, I'm not a Republican anymore, but I still read George Will. But of course, I read Paul Krugman too. And I'm going to quote from George Will's column this morning. He quoted from a new book written, a collection of short stories written by the actor Tom Hanks, which now I'm going to buy. And his quote from the Tom Hanks short story is the following. He says, quote, this is Hanks writing it fictionally. He said, quote, being Anna's boyfriend was like training to be a Navy SEAL while working full-time in an Amazon fulfillment center in the Oklahoma Panhandle in tornado season, unquote. And then Will goes on to say, after the past 4 years, Americans know the feeling. So yes, there is such a thing as political exhaustion. And I think if Donald Trump is not reelected next week, while there will be many, many reasons for that decision, I think that exhaustion will be a large part of it. So Bob's premise is exactly right.
The only point that I would add to that is that, you know, American electoral politics is an outlier amongst other democracies in terms of the length of voting, the length of campaigning. Ours is just incredibly long. I don't think that vote by mail is really impacting this because it already existed. It's really not changing the contours. It only is changing the fact that it takes longer to count. But no matter what, it leaves a paper trail, and we're going to have some sort of outcome that hopefully is not going to have to be adjudicated by our federal courts. So I agree wholeheartedly with Dan. It can't get any longer.
Well, that is certainly a relief for me to hear. I know we have 1 minute left, so just to wrap up really quickly, if I could have both of you, and Dan, I'll start with you. What would you say succinctly is your prediction about what you think will play out in the days leading up to and then following Election Day on Tuesday?
Well, hopefully we'll see a divisive outcome next Tuesday in order to avoid any problems. But if it is a close election, I predict that we will ultimately resolve this in a peaceful way, but that there could be some very trying times along the way toward that resolution. And the one thing I'd ask from the types of community leaders who are part of the Pacific Council is set an example. Panic is contagious, but calm is contagious also. And if we set an example for the people in our community on the left and the right, that an unresolved election is not a reason for unrest or for violence, it's much more likely that we can keep the peace through a very difficult time period going forward. And I think that's a responsibility that comes from being a community leader, even if you're not an elected official. Set an example for people who don't know this the way you do. And if people like the members of Pacific Council stay calm, I feel much, much better about us getting to that peaceful resolution in as less difficult a way as possible.
Sonia?
Yeah, you know, I think that we're already seeing a glimpse of historical voter participation in the midst of a global pandemic, which nobody really could have foreseen. And it really gets to the heart of what President Barack Obama has said time and time again, which is that the American people are hopeful, that he knows from communities, not just on the coast or in the South, but in the center. They care about each other. And so right now, until our government gets its act together at all levels in overcoming this pandemic, and addressing misinformation, it's incumbent on all of us to really hold true and hold close that we have a duty to be trusted messengers, to share accurate, legitimate information, and to recognize the things that are rational. If you're counting by hand, it takes longer. If you're counting by hand, ballots have a paper trail. We have seen time and time again that voter fraud is non-existent. And so we don't need to give into that. Now, to the other point is that we just need to be fair and patient with each other. We're in a turbulent, chaotic time for which we have been, in some ways, at our very worst and really with scarce resources. So recognizing this is really important as we treat everybody with grace and humility and, most importantly, dignity. I believe that our democracy can work. I'm excited to continue to work in making sure that it's an inclusive democracy with an echo chamber of diverse voices. And I look to all of you in upholding that promise of our country here. Thanks so much.
Well, I'm glad we can end on a hopeful message there. And if nothing else, I definitely took from this that we can set the example for how we should be going out to vote and how we should be encouraging others to vote and participate in our democracy. So I thank you both so much for joining us to speak about this important subject. And thank you so much to our audience for joining. And I know that this is something that we're all watching very closely. So hopefully we can all rest a little bit easier knowing that two qualified experts have told us that we have very little to worry about right now besides making sure we go out and vote ourselves and set that example for others. So I hope you all have a wonderful weekend. And again, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.
Bye.
Take care. Stay safe.